Welcome to today's Corporate Venturing Insider series. Today is going to be very special. We have Thomas Hellmann from the University of Oxford with us, and he's going to talk to us about entrepreneurship, corporate venturing, investment. But I also know there's a very unique story which I didn't know about, so I don't think you knew about it, about Apple and their CVC. Thomas, welcome.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here.
So let's start with how did you get interested about entrepreneurship and venture capital and any type of investors?
It was a very unexpected journey. I was through and through an academic. I was a doctoral student, and I was fortunate to be at Stanford University. This was, basically in the early '90s. I chose Stanford over Harvard because the shadows on the photos were shorter, so there was more sun. And I didn't know anything about tech. I didn't know anything about entrepreneurship. I was just going to become a macroeconomist or something like that. And during my thesis, I met two very inspirational professors. One of them was Joseph Stiglitz, who went on to get the Nobel Prize in economics. And he was incredibly inspirational because he just showed us the power of how economics could analyze all sort of interesting, important aspects of life, of society. And there was just no boundary to his creativity. And then I had a second advisor who was really inspirational. It's the late Professor Masahiko Aoki, who was actually a thought leader in Japan and turned academic and firmly believed that academics have a place to in the real world to sort of, think about the bigger picture and also the
Mhm.
institutions that sort of underlie the economy. And so at the time, basically, I wanted to write a thesis about Japanese banks because everybody was talking about Japan and how their banking system was, special. And in a moment of brilliance, this wonderful Japanese professor basically said, Thomas, maybe it's a little challenging for you to really understand what's happening in Japan. But why don't you look around at what's happening here in Silicon Valley? Because it's kind of interesting. And basically, he gave me the tip, why don't you study venture capital? Something interesting is going on. And this was at a time when Silicon Valley was very different from today. I think that's really important. It was in the formative stages. It wasn't, the very early days, but it was still nowhere near the level of publicity and frankly, wealth. And so it was an industry that was just coming. And frankly, I was very lucky. I was basically among the first generation of scholars that took venture capital serious. And so, there's a set of research that, I'm a researcher to begin with, where I think early on we shed some light on what venture capital is. And 30 years later, the understanding of what venture capital is completely different. And, the academic research has become much more specialized. But it was really exciting because at the time we were just trying to understand what's special about venture capital. And once I've started interviewing these people and started to, I'm really trying to understand what they do. I got hooked, and 30 years later, I'm still working on the topic.
So which year was it?
This was early '90s, '92 or thereabouts. That
92 would be Intel Capital was 1 year old.
Yes, exactly. Yes. We had Andy Grove teaching at the business school. I saw him in the '90s. Fascinating, very visionary leader.
Yep. Okay, and so what happens afterwards? I'm going to double click on a few things you've already said, but I don't want to stop you there.
Yeah, okay. I'll tell you one very quick little story, and this may be irrelevant for some people, but I think it's still interesting. Basically, because I'm a European, I grew up in Europe. I was very interested in venture capital in Europe, and I spent several months trying to interview people. Half the people didn't know the difference between venture capital and sort of general venturing or I mean, the confusions were endless. Um, and so I basically spent all this time trying to answer the question, why is there no venture capital in Europe? And my piece of advice to anybody writing a doctoral thesis: don't write something about something that doesn't exist. Basically, it was impossible because we were trying to explain the absence of something. It's actually quite a fundamental point. And when you try to explain the absence of it, you've got a very long list of explanations, explanatory variables, but there's no way of disentangling them. So back then, this is now 30 years ago, we basically built this very, very long list of why Europe doesn't have venture capital, meaningful venture capital. And the list was very long. And I'd say, 30 years later, most of the items on the list turned out to be wrong. It just took a lot more time. So, we're basically living in this, I call it a 50-year venture capital revolution, and we're halfway through, especially in Europe. I mean, Silicon Valley in the US is always the leader. But so basically, the insight is that even though there are many factors that prevent Europe from having it then, at the time, it took 25 years to build the institutions. And this has to do with people's willingness to take risk, yes, but it has to do with financial institution. The corporates, I think, do play a very important role. We need exit markets. We need staged financing. All of these things came. It just takes a long time to build. Anyway, so what I did is just, to answer the question, after I finished the thesis, I was very lucky and I got a job across the street. So I was in the Department of Economics. I walked over to the business school and therefore got exposed to the crazy world of entrepreneurship. And at the time when I think it was really in its formative stages.
And you did a PhD there. So what was the PhD about?
Yeah, so the PhD was in the Department of Economics with Stiglitz, with Oki, and that was basically a theory of venture capital. I was quite theoretical. My work was quite mathematical at the time. Later on, I became much more data oriented, but it was basically a conceptualization of the value that's provided by venture capital and the conditions under which venture capitalists can add value.
So many questions I want to ask, but I have to ask about Andy Grove because he's clearly iconic and you've met with him. And so what was the one thing you learned from him that you still apply today?
Yeah, I will never forget that. Now, Andy Grove was teaching a class with a fantastic colleague of mine called Robert Bergelman. And Robert was a very experienced teacher. They were co-teaching a tech entrepreneurship class. I was just a fly on the wall. And Andy was teaching. I thought it was very interesting. But maybe it wasn't the most dynamic class. And normally we stopped at half past, and at quarter past, he just said, okay, we're going to take a break now. Everybody said, okay, walked out. I just walked out. And I saw Andy coming out and talking to Robert Bergelman. And he is the CEO of one of the most powerful companies in the US, talking to a poor academic. And Andy asked Robert, what am I doing wrong? Why are they not responding? Why is this class dragging? What do I do? So I was just so impressed by the humility, but also the intelligence that Andy had. He realized that it wasn't working. And instead of blaming the students, which would have been the easy thing, he said, tell me, what can I learn? And I thought that was very impressive.
That is amazing. Okay, I'm glad I had the question. Wow. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and he was known to be a lifelong learner. I think that was one of the really impressive things, that don't assume you know it just because you've been around for 30 years.
Yeah. Well, actually, if you think about Intel being able to move from memories to the next generation of products, it requires humility too. You had to realize this was not the right path, and you had to have the team willing to change. That was a major pivot.
Yes, yes. I mean, the person who talked to Robert Bergelman was actually very close to Intel. He spent 10 years inside Intel. And he also debunked this story a little bit, because with hindsight, it was positioned as a brilliant pivot that top management led. It wasn't. This was a Skunks Works bottom up initiative. Initially, they were ignored, but tolerated. And as the new business developed, senior management woke up and said, "What a brilliant pivot!" And so, I mean, it does reflect the reality. You know much more about this than I do, but it does reflect the reality of corporate venturing. It's, it's not just a top down thing.
Now, again, in 91, Intel Capital started, so it was really formative. You were close enough to Intel to understand some of what was happening. What do you remember of Intel Capital as a corporate VC in the early stages? Because I think I read that the head of the CVC was reporting directly to Andy Grove. So there was something very, very direct to the strategy building.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, at the time I met once was Les Vadez, who was running Intel Capital. If I think I'm getting the names and titles right, but um, it was very interesting. I actually told him about the Apple case study and the work that I'd done on and with Apple. He was extremely aware of this and really wanted to bring in the next generation of corporate venture capital. I mean, since then we've seen two or three more iterations on what corporate venture capital is. But I think he was very thoughtful in defining what a strategic objective is and what it isn't and what it can and what it cannot achieve. And I think, one of the challenges at the time was that corporate venture capital had a bad name in the entrepreneurial community. That were basically large companies taking advantage of entrepreneurs, and any smart entrepreneur would run away from them. Intel, I think, was very aware of that. Being in Silicon Valley, it's hard not to be aware of, maybe.
Yeah.
But I think he was among those people who basically accepted that as a ground premise, that you don't have the trust of the entrepreneur and that you need to build it. And you, at the same time, you need to, help them succeed to build their business. Now, I think there are always circumstances where corporate venture capital is relatively easy for the entrepreneur to it's relatively easy for the corporate to be aligned with the entrepreneurs, and other situations not. And the whole art of this is to sort of disentangle the incentives at the corporate level. In the case of Intel, they wanted, at the time, the main issue was, let's sell as many chips as possible, let people adopt computers, and anything that supports the greater use of a computing platform was a strategic complement, what I call a strategic complement. So in that sense, Intel had a relatively easy game, an easier game actually than Apple, Microsoft, and some of the others. But for Intel, it didn't really matter exactly what people do. Just use more computers and therefore buy more of our chips. And I mean, Les obviously understood that, but I think it also meant that Intel had a good shot. And I think did, from you would know the details better, but did very well for a long time in
Well,
corporate
they
venture
are in
capital.
the news right now because they have announced they are going to spin off from Intel and they are going to change their name. And I think they invested, I want to say, more than $2 billion and 2,000 companies. And for them to 34 years later spinning off is quite big in corporate venturing, as you can imagine. It, Actually, let me ask the question. Would you have predicted they would have had such a long run as a CVC?
No, no. In fact, I knew you know this much better than I do, but the worry with CVC is always that it's the baby of the current CEO and changes with the next, or the CEO turnover, or just even with the next, even on the same CEO, you may get a strategy turn. So no, I think the Intel was remarkable for at least the first decade. They were the leading example of how to do corporate venture capital, right?
Yeah.
I mean, since then, there are many more, but I think I never would have predicted it to last 30 years. And some people have described corporate venture capital as a deliberate temporary strategy to address certain corporate challenges.
I mean, I've learned a lot from them and from many members of Intel Capital. They are one of the best CVCs we know, and they've done really, really well. I think I just said 2 billion, but it's 20 billion investments they've made over
Yeah,
34
I was
years.
actually wondering.
Right? An order of magnitude wrong. So, but no, they are one of the best we know, and it's. I mean, I'm assuming part of what's happening with Intel is driving some of that. So maybe I should interview someone from Intel Capital to have more of the way of framing it. But this is big. Now I want to move to the story about Apple CVC because no one knows about Apple CVC story.
Yeah, I mean, I actually discovered it more or less by accident, and I actually wrote up a small case study. It's still available on the Stanford case series. Um, but it was a fascinating story that gets precisely at this tension of how much do the corporate venture capitalists pursue a corporate strategy versus trying to attract entrepreneurs and focusing on making themselves attractive to the entrepreneurial community. And basically, this is in the first half of the 80s, I think around 84 or thereabouts. Apple decided that there was so much opportunity and that it wanted to grow and it wanted to have a corporate venture capital division. And when it started, it basically did a little bit of research and very quickly found out that corporate venture capital has a bad name and that entrepreneurs don't want to work with them because there's a conflict of interest and they pursue their own corporate goals at the detriment of the entrepreneurs. And so when Apple set up this venture capital fund, it said, we're not going to make that mistake. And they set up a venture capital unit, essentially. I mean, it wasn't an independent fund, but they said, we're going to give you a lot of investment independence. We want you to make the best investments. We want you to behave like a venture capitalist. And we're not going to emphasize strategic returns. And we're going to measure you on IRR. We just want you to make really good deals, and we want you to get deep into the venture capital community. And so they set this up and gave them quite a bit of leeway. And then they started making investments, and literally, I think it was like the third or fourth deal that they looked at was a complicated deal. And it wasn't a straight venture capital investment, and they ended up buying a small company, and the company was doing a number of products and it was all a mess. And they said, well, we're not going to look at strategic interest of Apple. We're going to think what is best, where is the highest value of these assets. And they decided that the company needed to be split in two. And one of them became Claris. It's not super well known, but it was a subsidiary, wholly owned subsidiary of Apple that was developing, I can't even remember exactly what. And the other thing that really didn't fit in was this weird product that was called PowerPoint. And they didn't know what to do with this thing. And they sold it to the highest bidder, who was Microsoft. And so Apple had control over PowerPoint, sold it to Microsoft to help them complete this Microsoft suite. And, for the next decade, Apple struggled. So it was a monumental strategic mistake. But
Whoa.
it was the mandate of the venture capital arm.
I know, but this is like do no harm, and here it's like do harm to your mothership.
Yeah, I mean, it was. I mean, the mothership bought into the strategy until they realized this isn't working. Um, the, I mean, to make the long story short, the venture capital did extremely well. It had, I don't remember the exact numbers, they're in the case, but I believe they had IRRs over 80%. So this beats,
Really
certainly
VC.
top decile VC returns. So these were good venture capital investments, great returns.
Yeah.
And the board just, cut it after 5 years. They said, this is ridiculous. We're making 80% IRR on tiny sums of money, and we're giving away things like PowerPoint, where the strategic value is 100 times whatever IRR we're making on, a small amount. I think it does. I think it has really two really important lessons. I mean, first is you can't go all the way. You can't pretend as a corporate that you're just running a venture capital fund.
Yeah.
That lesson I think is very apparent. You have to be thoughtful about the strategic objectives, but without them, it's just not worth it. And the other one is just orders of magnitude. That Apple. I mean, this is the '80s. Apple was growing very fast, but I don't remember the exact amounts. But say it was 20 million, and then you make an 80% IRR on it. It's still rounding error
Yeah.
for the size of investments that Apple corporate was looking at. And so I think this order of magnitude is really nicely illustrated with the Apple case study.
Okay, we will link somewhere the case study so that
Yeah, yeah,
anyone who
yeah.
wants to check it out can know where to find it. But okay, let me ask a challenging question. If they had decided to keep PowerPoint in Apple, do you think that CVC would actually have prospered because they would have shown 80% IRR plus a massive strategic move? Because at the end, I think most CVCs have 1 to 5 top success that people will remember. And here they didn't. If anything, people remember they made such a big mistake. So do you think that would have changed the journey for Apple CVC?
Without a doubt. Although it is never clear where the credit would have gone, in the sense that if they had just kept it, they would also have been the intermediate, the middleman that nobody remembers because they remember somehow PowerPoint and then Apple developing PowerPoint. So I think internally they would have reminded everybody that they were part of that story, but credit gets diffused.
Yeah, it's like success has many facets or something like this.
Exactly. Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
exactly. Very nice.
So you work in Oxford, so I have to ask, and you mentioned that there was no VC in Europe or nearly nothing at the time. Clearly, that has developed quite well. Actually, I shouldn't say well. It has grown quite a bit, but there's a lot of challenge for VCs in Europe to do well today. And part of what I read on LinkedIn, so you will have to challenge me if I'm saying something wrong, is the way governments become LPs and create requirements on investments is kind of creating dynamics which are not helpful neither for the entrepreneurs nor for the investors.
I
Do
think
you
that's
think?
mostly rubbish. I think that's
Okay,
mostly rubbish,
great.
and it probably comes from America because the Americans continue to maintain that the government played no role in the venture capital industry, which means they don't understand their own history. The government has been and in some ways still continues to be an incredible important component for the venture capital industry. There would be no Silicon Valley, if it wasn't for the Department of Defense.
That is
The
true.
Department of Defense is becoming more important again. Dual use technology is a hot topic. So it's very typical. There's a very nice intellectual tension. A good colleague and friend of mine, Josh Lerner, wrote a famous book called The Boulevard of Broken Dreams, in which he basically, with really good nuances. I mean, Josh is a thoughtful guy, but he basically brings sort of this notion that governments are just in the way for the venture capital industry. I mean, on the other extreme, Mariana Mazzucato wrote the exact opposite book, arguing that the state-led innovation. I have a doctoral student who actually wrote a thoughtful thesis about this. It's very detailed, it's very objective, it's factually based, in which he looks at the development of the European venture capital industry. And I think you're going to love this one. But I mean, he basically comes to the conclusion that probably the biggest success story of government support for venture capital is France. I presume with the name Nicolas Sauvage that you are French, although I shouldn't
Absolutely. So
think
I like this.
Swiss or Belgium or anything else. But BPI France has been an essential part of how France has developed the tech sector. BPI France is very unique. My student actually traced the history of it, and there were a lot of political risks, and it was with frankly a lot of very thoughtful people and a lot of good luck that it managed to create an institution that is relatively insulated from political pressures, but that has a very clear mandate, a national mandate to develop a venture capital industry. And the beauty about BPI France is they really sort of have this sort of supply chain or value chain approach where they're going from very early stage to late stage, and then they also have sort of they're not doing what Mariana Mazzucato recommends, which is sectoral policies. They're saying we're supporting an ecosystem, and they're quite industry agnostic. So without that, France wouldn't have a venture capital industry. It's very simple. Um, there are subtleties to it. I mean, my doctoral student, he himself is Italian. He did a comparison of Spain and Italy and showed how Italy got it all wrong, and Spain, two Mediterranean countries, was somewhat comparable. Let's say broad economic conditions. Spain actually developed with a more thoughtful approach a decent tech sector and venture capital industry. So no, I completely disagree with the claim that the government has been in the way. Now, the principles by which the European venture capital industry was developed, by and large, are the principles of the European Investment Fund, the EIF, which is obviously coming out of the EIB, and it's always been market led. So this notion that it's government or market is just wrong. It's wrong in the US, but it certainly doesn't work in Europe. And I do think that there is a maturation. There's a need that these support institutions, which are meant initially as catalysts, eventually withdraw and develop a market that has much less government, in it. But on balance, and I can back up some of this. I did a worldwide study of the role of government venture capital, and we analyzed a whole bunch of data, and the main conclusion was that the performance of companies backed by government venture capital is only lower if the government entities are the only investors, but is actually higher than pure private market when there is syndication between government-led and private-led investors. That's the key finding, and I absolutely believe that's still very relevant.
And I think syndication typically leads to better results. So I think that is not too surprising. What I find amazing with what you said, and of course, being French, this is something I'm already liking, but I think BPI France started in 2012. So we're not looking at old history. We're looking at 12, 13 years in the making. And the study and the results prove that the value it brought to the country is strong.
Yeah. I mean, there were precursors, and BPI France basically amalgamated a number of other initiatives. Probably without BPI France, these initiatives would have drifted in less coherent ways, and so BPI France actually brought, I think, some coherence to the government program. I mean, the key point, though, and I think it's just worth re-emphasizing, is that there was a mandate by the government to support the ecosystems, but there was fundamental principle of working with the market and of being essentially non-interventionist. That's to say, unlike what everybody knows about or thinks about France as dirigisme and industrial policy, the support of the venture capital industry wasn't. One of the really interesting early subtleties in this is that a lot of the messages, in fact, a lot of the sort of consultants and actually people coming from the US and telling you how to do it, they always said, you have to go for high tech. And the French reformulated it as high growth. And the activities
This
of
is genius, by the way.
It's just translation mistake. Sorry, we heard it incorrectly. We heard high growth. I'm joking. But it was a fundamental thing.
Yeah, I have to interview someone from BPI France.
Sorry.
No, I have to interview someone from BPI France now.
They're fantastic. They're very. They're very interesting. I'm not saying everything is perfect. There are some real challenges, like everywhere. But no. Interestingly enough, part of the story also compares it to Germany, and the German experience is much more mixed. KfW, High Tech Gründerfonds, it sort of worked, and it was probably on balance still a good thing for the economy, but it didn't have the clarity of the intervention that we saw in France.
So beyond that good design decision from the start, is there anything you can pinpoint at what BPI France or French government with BPI did well that other countries should consider in their own design if they want to do the same?
Well, I think the most important is they kept the politicians out and they let the bureaucrats run it. I mean, it's literally as simple as that. And there were certain moments where certain politicians were literally trying to control the program. And at the last moment, and this was the board of directors of BPI France, which somehow functioned well, and it managed to basically throw out the political influences and let them say, no, this is the administration runs it, and we're going to build the economy with this.
Okay, I'm loving it. So, what's your view on venture capital, including corporate VCs in Europe? Do you see them professionalizing, improving? I mean, I'm really curious about how you see Europe taking advantage or not of these investors.
I'm an optimist. Maybe I'm not 100% objective because I've always been very enthusiastic about the European mission. But I just, and I alluded to it before, 25 years ago, we had a long list of why Europe could never develop a venture capital industry. It doesn't have the technology, it doesn't have the mentality, it doesn't have the capital, it doesn't have the stock markets. And one by one, we've chipped away at these constraints. And today, one of the things that really encourages me, and this is something that I just see in my own work, is that there is a young generation that wants to become venture capitalist, that wants to either pursue the entrepreneurial path, or if they're pursuing the finance path, veer towards the venture side as opposed to the traditional investment banking side. So we have a lot of really smart young people who want to get this right, who see this as a more interesting and meaningful career than sort of just joining the large banks. And they're finding ways and new models of investing in startups that differs in subtle ways from the American model. Still has a lot to learn from the American model, no doubt. And, any venture capitalist, I always say, try to spend some time, whatever time you can, in the US and learn as much as you can. But I think the the biggest the biggest challenge is the US model is based on a unicorn logic. And we're trying very hard to do this in Europe. And it's not wrong. The unicorn model increases the ambition, it increases the awareness of competition, but you can make very good returns in a portfolio in which you have a lot of good investments and no unicorn. And I think that's very relevant in the corporate venture capital world. I'm sure you've had many people discussing these issues. The reason I am somewhat optimistic is I think that if you think of venture capital just as a returns distribution, everybody talks about the right tail. Sorry, that's not my right tail here. I don't know how it shows up on the screen, but we can we love the success stories in the right tail. But there are parts of the middle distribution. If we just move this thing by 5-digit points or 10-digit points, we can create very good returns. Remember, there were now periods, there were years where the European venture capital industry had higher returns than the American venture capital industry. I mean, the data fluctuates. It depends on exactly the data provider and so on. But it's no longer true, which it was true for the first 20 years, that the returns in Europe were just clearly worse. That's no longer true.
Mm-hmm.
So the way we build the returns is a little bit more in the middle of the distribution. I'm therefore optimistic. I do think the issue that you brought up about the government isn't going to go away, at least not for the next decade, in the sense that the economic interest in Europe is still very important. I think this is an economic necessity, so we can't afford to let the venture capital industry die. Um, but I do think that by the time you sort of get to a second generation of European venture capitalists, you're building such a level of expertise and so
Mm.
much more refined, detailed thinking that we're not just trying to do what the guys in Sequoia are doing in the US and then realizing it doesn't work.
Yep,
That
yep.
this new generation is figuring out new ways, often subtle changes in the way that they finance companies that makes this a viable investment.
Which makes more polished, more disciplined investors.
Yes, yes. I mean, I think one of the really difficult questions is the geography of that within Europe.
Yes.
And, I mean, basically, when we started, it was nothing, but then London, then Paris, then Berlin, maybe Amsterdam. Uh, I do think it's interesting that when I talk to some of the venture capitalists, they're telling me they're beyond that stage. And, if there's a small company in Lille or in Augsburg or in Verona, they will go and travel there. And it has become possible. Still, I'm very aware there are limits as to, entrepreneurship happens in agglomeration, and i I do worry that sort of this desire to make venture capital available for everybody is not going to work. It is an industry that needs to be concentrated. It needs these ecosystem effects, and so uh, i I worry a lot about the main hubs doing well. And if we start with London, Paris, Berlin, that's not a bad start, but they really have to function. And if Lille doesn't function, then that's just the economic reality.
Yeah. I mean, you're in Oxford, so you're part of that golden triangle we talk about in the UK. So you're part of these three magical hubs. Um, but I think you're making a very important point, which is the hubs have to function well. You need to get these success stories and you need to get this level of skills to be able to hope for propagation across the full of Europe.
Yeah. I mean, one of my favorite statistics it comes out of the Atomico report every year, the state of tech in Europe, the Atomico report. It's very much driven by Nick Zenstrom, I think, who is obviously an inspirational tech
Yep.
leader in Europe. And they always put in the little Skype graph, which is basically the copy of what you see for PayPal in the US, the PayPal mafia. Well, you've got the Skype family in Europe. And because basically Skype and the founders of Skype and the early employees of Skype have built the ecosystems. If you go to Estonia, it's basically the children of Skype who are running the tech sector there, and it's a
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
fantastic. If you haven't talked to them, make sure to invite them. They're
Oh, my
awesome.
first investment was in Starship that started with Ati, who was one of the founder of Skype. So actually, my very first investment was already in that Skype ecosystem.
Wonderful. So the Skype ecosystem is really important. The graph in the Atomico report has something really interesting because they call it the flywheel. I pay attention to this flywheel and the fact that the flywheel is accelerating. What that means is the flywheel is basically what falls out of a good startup is serial founders, employees who become founders. And what the graph or the Atomico graph shows is that the flywheel is accelerating. So when it took maybe 20 or 10 years to generate 1,000 founders coming out of successful startups, it now only takes 5 years to generate 1,000 founders. So
Mm.
basically, I think the way I think about ecosystems is in terms of these generations. If you have a first generation, there's some amazing heroes, but there are few, they're isolated, and they have really hard experiences. And they pass on their wisdom and say, this is how it works in Berlin, or this is how you can do it in Paris. And then they pass that knowledge on to the second generation and then even to a third generation. And that's when we have a real ecosystem. And this is one of the reasons why I'm so optimistic about these European centers, because we're now having these second generations. I firmly believe in that.
So it's interesting. So my own belief of why the US venture capital works so well, especially in the Silicon Valley, is a paying forward mindset where you're helping others with no agenda to get something back. What you just described is a paying forward mindset being applied in Europe more and more. That gives me reasons to believe Europe is going in the right directions to get more entrepreneurs with better coaches, better examples, learning faster, so the cycle goes faster. So I think that that's how I'm taking what you just said.
Yeah, no, and I mean, frankly, it actually brings up a number of issues that they're very close to my heart and things that we're also, really trying to help with at Oxford, which is there is a need for young entrepreneurs to get to the right information in an efficient way. And some of this is what I call general entrepreneurship education. So I spend a lot of time in thinking about this. And with online education, we're doing more and more things that we can reach thousands of entrepreneurs. My online courses now, I know what you do, but they know me.
I really enjoyed your videos. So I highly recommend anyone to check your name and search for your videos because they are really well constructed.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So, I mean, just the availability of entrepreneurship education. Now, you did mention coaching, mentoring. I think that's very important, and we have some experiences, and these are things that we're trying to give to our students, including at Oxford and beyond. I mean, I think the value of mentoring cannot be overstated. And your point, I think, was a profound one, that it works when it is paying forward, when people are doing it because they love passing on the knowledge, they love helping the next generation. And yes, if they open up their checkbook and write a first check, nothing wrong with that.
No, never.
That we like that, and the entrepreneurs like it, believe me. But it's that understanding and just sometimes emotional support of a good mentor that makes a huge difference. And so that's something that I think we're actively engaged with.
I think there is one more thing about the paying forward, which I think is very different in Europe, is you have your Rolodex and this is your assets, your contact list, and you don't want to share it unless you get something. I go to Silicon Valley and you start exposing an idea, and people say, "Oh, I could introduce you to A, B, and C. Let's try, let's check." And there is no intentions to get any value from it beyond helping someone. So the paying forward is beyond coaching, mentoring, but also helping introduce to the right people. It's hard to believe unless you're there and you see it. And because you were based in the Bay Area, you had first-hand experience. But this is really special.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree. And that's what you need as an entrepreneur. Somebody who's just saying, I think you can talk to X, and why not? X is a big deal. Doesn't matter. X will talk to you. I'll make the introduction.
Yeah. Now I want to touch on something you've studied and you wrote about, which is the value of venture capital, especially from the entrepreneurs point of view, but I really want to make it wide. What is the value of venture capital? What would be the case to make it 10x what it is today? Or is that a case where it shouldn't grow too much and that because that would defeat the purpose of the value it's supposed to bring?
Yeah, I mean, first, maybe just to provoke a little bit. I remember vividly, this was literally at Stanford many years ago. We had a panel of investors and entrepreneurs. Actually, it was entrepreneurs. It was a panel of entrepreneurs. And the question came, so, venture capital, do they really add value? And then, these entrepreneurs went on and said, oh, no, it's the big lie. These guys, they don't do anything. They don't know anything. They don't understand my business. They don't do anything. And then somebody in the audience said, oh, that's interesting. So do you think that angel investors are better than venture capitalists? And then the person turned red and said, my God, they ruined my company. They gave me the wrong advice. They forced me to do things. And they thought that the best outcome was that still the venture capitalists because they did it, and that angels were worse. So what I took away from that is what the entrepreneur says sort of has a downward bias. And then if you put it sort of into focus,
Yeah.
then you can say, hang on, some of these venture capitalists are actually pretty awesome. because they didn't ruin my company. And it's so easy to ruin a company. Because if you apply any of the standard metrics used in an established business, you're going to ruin the startup. It's, you need that different frame of mind. You need the patience and the impatience in a strange combination.
Yeah.
You need to have an understanding of what signals you should and what signals you shouldn't pay attention to. And cash flows isn't the signal that you should pay attention to early on, but you need to still pay attention to what's happening with your customer. So there are all these subtleties. Investors need to understand them at the minimum, because they're going to recommend or write the next check. So I think there's a huge variety within the venture capital world. So what I tell all the entrepreneurs is, I would definitely talk to venture capitalists. These are professionals. They want to make it work. They want to generate a return. And but there are significant differences in their approaches, in their philosophies, in their honesty, and in all of these things. So as an entrepreneur, you do your homework. Having said that, I think the value of venture capital is substantial. I continue to believe in it, and we've done some research in it, in which we showed of it. Actually, just going back to some of my earlier research, this was based in Silicon Valley. Just a simple thing. It was just one statistics among many. Um, the way that companies hire, what we saw is the HR approaches changed from hiring your friends to using professional methods of hiring. It may not sound like a big deal, and even when we wrote the result, I didn't think it was a huge thing. I just thought it was a neat finding. And the more I thought about it, said, wait, this is really profound. This is really profound. Because,
And you're doing it more. Yeah.
yeah, and this is an aspect of professionalization that venture capitalists, having seen this and having in some sense the mandate to walk the entrepreneur through a process of professionalization that doesn't come natural to them. And once the once you go through the venture capital route, I guess it's just assumed normal, but it may not happen that way without the venture capital world. You just don't think about these issues, and so you don't set in place certain key, simple structural elements of your company that are essential when you want to scale, right? And if everybody you hired is just your uncles and cousins and so on, you're probably not going to have a scale up. But if you have a set of people who say, this is my career chance and I'm going to join this startup and I'm going to grow this, then you have a chance. So I think venture capitalists do add value. I think there are a lot of misunderstandings about what that means. And sometimes the value is discipline, and that's not always easy to swallow for the entrepreneur.
I like it. And so I'm going to give first, you mentioned Lille earlier. I'm from Lille. So I'm going to
Oh,
mention,
you're serious? That is
yeah,
hilarious. I'm
yeah,
just
I'm
picking a
serious.
random city.
And what is nice is I'm part of a guest lecture at Stanford for people who come from Lille, entrepreneurs from Lille, and they come to Stanford for a week. And it's funny because they all ask me, why should we take VC money? And my answer is very provocative. I say, please don't take VC money unless you really want to become a very big company, very successful. But taking VC money comes with a level of pressure, of discipline, of expectations that many of you may not want to have. And I want you to comment on this, because I think entrepreneurs dream about the stories that you see in movies where you take VC money and you big. How much of that is true for most people, for most entrepreneurs? And when is it the right thing for an entrepreneur to want to take VC money?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are lots of nuances. Let me go to the provocative end. I don't know if you had him on your podcasts, but a good friend is Noam Wasserman, who's written The Founder's Dilemma. It's a good book. I mean, about what it's like to be a founder. And Noam likes to provoke, so he basically asked, "Do you want to be rich or do you want to be king?"
Yeah.
I'll call it king or queen. What Noam is trying to say is you do have choices to face as an entrepreneur. And if you want to scale, you're going to lose control. So you give up your kingdom. But it can lead to what he calls the rich strategy. And I actually think that the key is scale. So do you want to scale or control is the way I will, just rephrase it. I know it makes it more provocative, but
Yeah.
do you want to scale or control? And I think that it is a deeply personal question. It is also a question about the strength of the ecosystem. So there are many countries where you should never lose control, because the moment you lose control, you basically get just kicked out, and the governance doesn't work. But it does
Mm.
work in the US. You
Yeah.
can step down from the company and you still get a fair return, and you still maybe have a role in the company. I still love the chief Yahoo move, becoming chief instead of being a CEO. I become chief Yahoo. I don't know what that is, but it gave him a role in the company that suited him better than the role of the CEO.
Mm.
And so giving up control, I think, is a, a, a question well worth asking. The answer may depend on your personal preferences. It may depend on the ecosystem and the culture that you're in. But scalable companies have many attractive features. And chances are you won't scale the way you want, but nothing wrong with setting up the ground conditions so you have a scalable company that, if it works well, you can actually scale. So I still think that if you educated yourself what it means to be take venture capital, and you're basically comfortable in saying, I don't have to control this thing, I'm going to make this the most impactful organization possible,
Yeah.
and you pick the right VC, it's a good thing. I just think people have to understand what they're doing, and it's definitely not every venture, and there are many ventures that shouldn't go or just are wasting their time going the VC route.
It's interesting you mentioned Noam Wasserman and the founder's dilemma, because end of last year there was all these discussions about founder's mode, which is the value of having the founder driving the company and continuing to do so. So it's nearly the devil's advocate to that, which is
Yeah.
there are things founders can do that professional CEO cannot do.
I think it's a wonderful debate. I think Paul Graham took a position which is great because it gets a debate going. It gets
Yeah.
people thinking about it. And I am quite weary of the extreme outlier examples, and people love to talk about Mark
There's
Zuckerberg,
the easy ones. Yeah.
and they're not relevant. They're not relevant. So if you look, somewhere where the majority of companies end up being, do founders still matter? Yes, very differently in different sectors. I'll give you a sector where it's really different: biotech.
Mm.
Um, just think about the role of founder. Well, often the founder is actually the scientist, and the last thing you want is that scientist to run the company. And good scientists understand where they fit into that, and a few of them transition into the managerial role, but the majority don't want to and shouldn't. And so clearly that's not true in biotech, what Paul Graham said, right? And so I think it's an interesting question: where are the where are the boundaries of that? I do think that founders can have a very important role, and it doesn't always have to be the CEO. That's why I'm quite a big fan of companies transitioning into professional CEOs with a well-defined role between founder and CEO. Easier said than done.
It's actually very challenging because it's their baby. There's some ego. There's some status. There's some
And then,
compensation.
and then it's time to go. And then it's time to go. The other thing that a lot of founders don't realize, I think timing really matters. Um, there are these inflection points. They're hard to define, but we intuitively know them, and say they coincide with a Series A or a Series B round. So let me just take Series B.
Mm.
I think it's one thing for a founder to say, oh, I'm going to lose control, or it's another to say, I'm going to lose control at Series B. You know what? The majority of founders don't enjoy life after Series B. It's a very, very different life than what you were doing at seed stage, right? And I think giving that perspective is to say, no, maybe there's a time where, you've put your imprint. You've created an organization, you imbued your values, you imbued your vision, and now let it go.
So you've given a few golden nuggets, but this is the biggest golden nugget, I think, for anyone who's listening, entrepreneurs and even investors, on how to frame that kind of discussion.
Yeah.
Because entrepreneurs love the 0 to 1. 1 to 10 can be fun, but this is very different already. The 10 to 100, 1000, this is different job. This is operational. This is repeat. This is very, very different. This is not necessarily what got excited from the 0 to 1.
Yeah. And I mean, I remember this in the early days. I met some of these guys in Silicon Valley, and I didn't understand. I said, "Why? You're just trying to get rid of your company? Don't you love it anymore?" And I say, "No, no, no. I love it. It's my baby, but it's time to let it fly." And I really want to go back and just go through the hustle because that's what I'm really good at. I love these entrepreneurs, and funny enough, they are all. It works better in a mature ecosystem. In a mature ecosystem, you can get somebody else to take that CEO position and say, I trust you enough. I know you won't do it the way I will, but I trust you enough that I can now let go and I can do my next one. And that's frankly when so interestingly enough, at the university, I often spend more time or have more access to founders who've just sold their company. That's when you have more time to go and talk to a university professor or teach a
Yeah.
little class. I talk to a lot of people who've just exited their investments and they're thriving. They're absolutely thriving. They're saying, for 7 years, my life was crazy. I loved it. And now I've sold this thing and I can go back into the cycle. I can have fresh ideas. I can explore. I can do the crazy things that I'm really good at. So I think that is a very healthy cycle.
And it's not just healthy. I think, yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I don't think it's just a healthy cycle. It's what makes these cycles of learnings and serial entrepreneurs being so powerful, and why many VCs take serial entrepreneurs as such a signal, because they went through it multiple times. They know what to do, they know what to watch, the pattern recognition kicks in, and everything else.
Yeah, I firmly believe in that.
Yeah. So let me ask, we are getting to the end of the podcast, and we talked about the value of venture capital. Now I really want to talk about or ask about the value of corporate venture capital. And here, assuming it's done well. So let's not talk about all the bad examples. Let's say if corporate venture capital is done well, what is the value to the entrepreneurs?
Yeah, since we talked about stages before, I think there's a big difference in the early and then in the later stage. I think starting Series B, let me just use that as a sort of point where we have something, it's well defined, it's scalable. Corporates are incredibly valuable. There are always this interesting tension between, well, is it an acquisition or is it a corporate venture capital? But irrespective of how you answer that, the reason you get to ask the question is that there is this enormous value that incumbents with distribution channels or deep R&D centers or whatever the asset is, play a huge role. And so I don't want to imagine a world in which there's no corporate venture capital, because part of the role of the entrepreneur is to challenge the status quo, but then it's also to transition it, to make it a reality. And that means at some point it has to join the status quo in some version or another. And the corporate venture capital is a really powerful element of that. So I think at the later stage, it's well understood. At the earlier stage, I think your assumption that it's done well is incredibly important, and it's hard for many corporations to, operate just in the rules of early stage financing. I remember a mentor that I thought had a beautiful saying, which said, early stage. Um, Probably no corporate investors, but if you get them, get two of them. Yeah, and it also so that they neutralize themselves a little bit. If you have one corporate investor, you may give undue power to an entity that either doesn't fully understand you or just has different strategic incentives. The moment you put in two of them, they kind of have to behave. And I don't know if you've seen that. This was this is not me experiencing it. This is listening to, giving back the advice I heard from others. But I thought there was something thoughtful and provocative about it, that the big problem in the early stage is that you have a powerful agent, and that is a very, obviously entrepreneurs are sometimes attracted because they want to say, I've got X on my, X on my cap table. But I think first and foremost, let's distinguish the early stage challenge from the late stage challenge. And the value proposition in the late stage, I think, is uncontroversial, and but much more difficult in the early stage. And frankly, I know you studied this a lot. The exact type of program that the corporate provides, at that stage is really matters. I
I
don't
think
know if you're
there's
no keep.
I think there is a discovery aspect. As your early stage, you're trying to find your product market fit. And so you want to avoid actors in your cap table, in your board, that's going to limit your options while you're still in discovery. What I think Series B, I think your point is you're already knowing your product market fit, you know what you want. At that point, having corporates and corporate VCs coming on your cap table, you already know what options you're not going to look for. So you're probably going in with eyes wide open.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then you can actually make use. The problem often in the early stage is that startup doesn't really know what to do. They've got a big corporate on there, but nobody at the corporate really understands what they do. They don't know what they want from the corporate. That's where I think things are more delicate.
Yeah. When we invest, so we invest in seed. We even did a inception of a company with other financial VCs. It's typically for an exploration mission where we want to learn about the market at the same time as the entrepreneurs who are building that market. And
Yeah,
so we have no expectations beyond we want to understand the market we know nothing about,
yeah, yeah.
which means we actually want the discovery to be as wide as possible. But I
That's
think
very
if corporate VC invest so early with a view of what they want, I think there is danger at that point.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, and then there is the and then this is it differs a lot by industry, but sometimes the moment one corporate sees the name on the cap table, all the others say, well, okay, they've cornered it. It's a signal we're no longer engaging with it. So but I mean, I think these are problems that you're starting to crack, and they're important problems to crack.
So I have one last question, and I have to ask because you mentioned about patience and impatience. And every day on my top of my to-do list, I have 8 words which I've refined over time to be my top priorities, my core values. And 3 of these 8 words is patience and impatience, which is basically knowing when to be patient and when to be impatient. And if I think about VC, it's this tension, which is you have a sense of purpose, which is really this patience aspect, but you also have this sense of urgency, which is this impatience. And so I need to double click. How do you see this tension between patience and impatience, especially as you need to help entrepreneurs, but that tension keeps coming back?
Really good question. And once you figured it out, let me know, because I don't think I know the full answer. But I'll tell you a little bit about it. The way I think about it is about goals and ways. You need to have impatience about the ways you proceed. In entrepreneurial businesses, it is very action oriented. You want the hustle, the implementer, and so I think most entrepreneurs themselves have that inherent impatience. They want the project to be done in a week, not in a month. Yeah, and so I think the impatience pertains to the activities. The patience is on the gold side, and it has a lot to do with the metrics that you use. And the biggest mistakes I see are often people coming with a finance background, looking at cash flows and evaluating startups and saying, well, where are your revenues? How comes these guys haven't signed up? And if you're trying to do complicated clean tech. They're going to have 3 pilots. The progress has to be measured by what's happening underneath the hood. And if you're just using the financial metric, you're not going to give justice to the amazing things that the company may be doing, right? So this is where the patience bit, it has to be patience based on a deeper understanding of the underlying business. It's not the patience of an accountant. It's the patience of somebody who says, no, there is real progress. These guys are doing something difficult, and what they've achieved in the last 6 months is amazing. It just hasn't generated revenue yet, right? And by the way, there's a huge difference with the industry background. I've seen this a lot.
Mm.
A lot of this impatience can come from people who are used to software development. And
Yes.
I live in a world with a lot of deep tech. And that mentality can really be detrimental because no, 6 months later, I still don't have revenue. I wasn't expecting to, but I've made some amazing progress because
Mm.
I'm trying to sell something that just has a different revenue profile over time.
I actually think that when I look at corporate VCs who come from the biotech, they understand venture capital so much better because I think that the discipline of the power law of medicine and the outcomes and the stage of financing, depending on the risk and what you want to discover, they apply that
Yeah.
in their mothership. Versus most companies where this is more of a distribution law type of outcomes versus a power law type of outcomes, which drives very different decision making.
Super interesting. Very interesting. Yeah. And then they wouldn't be used to that level of patience combined with the impatience. I love the fact that you have both of them on your to-do list.
Wow. Thank you, Thomas. This was amazing
Well, I have a deep
conversation.
apology. I did not mean to offend the people of Lille.
I'm,
It was literally a random name that came to me.
no, and so that the audience know, Lille is a beautiful city in France, and the people are so nice. And I recommend everyone to not just visit Paris if you go to France, but also visit Lille.
Very good. That you did very well. And since my
Thank you.
hometown is Brussels, I say stop by in Lille and then come to Brussels.
Thank you so much, Thomas.
Thank
Thank you very
you.
much.
Pleasure.